प्रसार भारती अभिलेखागार की प्रस्तुति सदाबहार सुनहरे दौर का अनमोल खजाना।
All of us know that there was never anything really called a silent cinema. In fact, all the auditoriums had a musical pit in front of the screen where an orchestra would perform to the accompaniment of the film on the screen. In India, we had narrators and sutradhars who would constantly tell the story that was taking place in the film. In a place like Japan, there used to be a character called the Benshi. Now, the audience would be sitting in the theater and facing this Benshi who would be narrating the story. The projection system was on the right and the screen was on the left. So therefore, the audience would be actually looking at the screen to reconfirm the story which the Benshi was narrating on the stage. Now, so popular was the notion of the spoken text that films in those days were replete with intertitles, constantly trying to tell the audience the story that was taking place on the screen. The greatest challenge of the silent cinema was to express everything through visuals and gestures, and thus interiorizing the actual process of the dialogue into the hearts and minds of the audiences. And in this case, we have seen brilliant examples. Although the silent filmmakers managed to contain their works in a very cohesive form, but the sheer realism of cinema demanded the introduction of sound. But why did it have to happen in 1928 and not 20 years before? What was the factor that suddenly swerved the audience from the rich accompaniment of lively background music in cinema theaters to the need for sound on the screen? The reason is absolutely uncanny. Just travel back to the year 1895, Lyon, France, where the Lumiere brothers had just introduced the motion picture camera and the projector. In that very same year, another brilliant scientist called Guglielmo Marconi discovered the telegraph machine using radio waves.
In a space 1,500 yards by 900 on that last day, I saw the dead and the living. Those who fought a good fight and kept the faith with you at home, and those who still...
By 1920, after a series of developments, from the vacuum tube to the sound amplifier, the first radio station was established in Pittsburgh, America. By 1925, the radio had become a household item, communicating everything from news, sports commentaries, symphonic concerts, and even the local gossip. Communication per se had developed a new aesthetic. Reality and the world around could now be perceived and reconstructed through sound, just like the way the visible world was reconstructed and created into a beautiful form through the juxtaposition of images. It was but natural that the factor of sound was going to be knocking at the doors of the cinema to complete the experience of the live world. Engineers tried various ways to somehow bring the sound onto the screen. At first, they tried to match the phonographic record with the projector. It was called the chronophone, but then there were many problems that came up with it. At first, they had to devise a speed lock mechanism by which this phonographic record could run at the same speed with the projector. On the other hand, they had another problem that the size of the projection reel was much bigger and longer than the average standard phonographic record. Besides, there were other problems like multiple projectors and synchronizing them with multiple phonographic records and so on and so forth. At a parallel level, work was being done on using radio valve and tube technology to aid cinema, and this was achieved by devising a photoelectric cell which could convert sound impulses into visual signals or variations. And that was the final knock on the silent cinema. The gramophone player or the Vitaphone continued to suffer from constant hiccups. If even by a slight mistake the record needle moved, then what we would have is a picture completely out of sync like this.
For I love you so, Sonny Boy.
Experiments into this had begun as early as 1900. In 1923, phonofilm, an optical sound system, was developed by Lee de Forest. This system was incorporated in the first workable optical sound system, Fox Movie Tone.
Charlie Sunday, 224, take 5. Action.
I met her working in a little store.
The optical sound systems were adopted by all studios within a few years. They were refined and updated, but the method of recording sound on film, converting it to a photographic image, which is read in the projector by a photoelectric cell, remains the basis for the optical sound systems of today.
There was no other option but to bring the film, image and the sound onto the same plane so that sound and picture could be projected at the same time on the screen.
And I heard about a very funny story then, because the funny story was that all the actors had to speak down on the bottom. That was the first thing. And if you look at some old movies, you see that they are talking to each other, but they are not really talking to each other, but they are looking on the floor. And the answer for that was the microphone was on the table and the floor. So the first thing when sound came up was the problem, where can I hide the microphone?
Be there at 10 o'clock. But they must not find Eddie.
A fixed microphone hidden here in the telephone restricted performances.
What you mean? Take him for a ride.
And the other thing was that the camera was free before that in the silent movies. And in the silent movies, if you remember films from Abel Gance, Napoleon, it's a wonderful movie where the camera, he throwed the camera up to make pictures, or he was running around. He had really something like a Steadicam system. But with the sound invention, they couldn't do that, because everything had to be silent. The camera was arrested.
Unlike the sophisticated and mobile camera work of the late silent era, the early sound cameras rarely moved, as their noise confined them to a soundproofed cabin. Hitchcock's Blackmail, originally planned as a silent film, was released in 1929 with the RCA sound system. It was heralded as the first full-length, all-talkie film made in Great Britain.
The early cameramen must have cursed those sound recorders while they sweated and fumed in those soundproof glass booths, waiting for the sound recorders to get their act together properly. So, producers and technicians just did not have the patience nor the courage to go through the elaborate procedures of the sound equipment. So, they ended up filming all their shots in long single takes. The cinema dell'arte movement of 1910 seems to have been born again. And to make matters worse, sound film was beset with hundreds of problems. At first, they needed a cameraman to handle this huge camera. And they needed other actors and crews to be silent during the take. And then, actors' movement were restricted as they had to face the microphone. And if they moved far away, they could not be heard. On the other hand, if they made a slight mistake, like a little cough, a little fluff, a little mistiming, everything would be picked up and amplified enormously on the big screen. Therefore, the sound cinema, which came along with the introduction of the microphone and the big camera, ended up looking like theatrical productions. All in all, the scene on the studio floors was really bad. But out on the streets, it was a very different story. The only positive side to this very depressing story was the fantastic audience response. And studios like these, the Prasad Film Studios, are proof enough about the warm audience appreciation. These studios decided that they could not be bothered about transiting from silent to sound cinema and all its problems. So they decided to put all the problems in the back lot and begin afresh, work on the technological aspects of sound and set up modern facilities. And unbelievable though it may sound, but within just 1 year, by 1929, King Vidor came up with a fabulous talkie film called Hallelujah. Ruben Mamoulian's Applause deals with the grimy realism of backstage atmosphere. This film certainly roots itself more in the visual expression rather than the shackles of sound. Surely a fine transition. This transition is complete with synchronization methods. Running picture and sound parallel to each other finally finds a simple solution: the Moviola. This rugged piece of equipment continues to be the editor's dearest companion. With this, he can work all kinds of miracles.
3,000 miles, 3 years, and all of a sudden you...
I had it all planned that way.
The recording and mixing of sound was an elaborate process.
Why?
Dialogue, sound effects and music were recorded separately and mixed together onto the final soundtrack.
Miles, 3 years, and all of a sudden you...
This possibility of working with sound material and picture material separately sounded like music to most professional ears. And by 1930, Louis Milestone came up with another brilliant achievement called All Quiet on the Western Front.
More days, would it? Did I tell you this was going to be a bad one?
Louis Milestone entered movies as a cutter. His first pictorial experience came as a photographer's assistant. And from his earliest films, he manifested a commendable concern for integral composition as well as shot juxtaposition.
Want to play some more? Do you?
foregrounds and backgrounds rarely go unfilled, and his frequently moving camera recedes or penetrates almost as often as it drifts laterally. Such touches may be no less flashy than razzle-dazzle montage, but by definition, the very integrity of screen space makes a more lasting claim on the viewer's credence, which is to say that Milestone can be both efficient and effective as a straight-action narrator. His comment on the cold-blooded machinery of wars is most effectively portrayed in this last sequence, where Lew Ayres notices a butterfly while sitting in a trench. He goes out to give this tiny soul a little help, but that would be his last human gesture.
Before we had the sound in the film, you could say that we actually didn't have screenplays. It's very interesting to consider. At that time it wasn't so expensive to do a film than it is today. So somebody like Charlie Chaplin, for example, in City Lights, he would have his whole staff hired, and he would start to film without a screenplay, and he improvised on the set whatever he needed, and then when he was ready at one point, the film was finished, and he didn't have a screenplay. Afterwards, maybe, if he looked at the film, he found a screenplay.
The coming of sound was also seen as a very cruel, inhuman phenomenon. In India, the sound era was ushered in by Ardeshir Irani with an elaborate spectacular called Alam Ara. Lale Yaman is certainly the closest relative to the style of the now lost Alam Ara.
हाँ, कितनी खूबसूरत हो।
आज कनिष्क की कदर तारीफ हो रही है।
क्यों नहीं? काश सूरत के साथ सिरत भी आई।
It is a classic Parsi theatre derived Oriental fantasy. What is stunning, of course, is the set construction with unusual values of depth. One is particularly amazed as to how the director would have gone about lighting such huge spaces with rostocks that could hardly gain a decent exposure even in bright sunlight. Today's children at the Museum of Moving Image in London seem to have absorbed the impact of sound, picture, editing and all, a far cry from the days when sound was seen as a terror.
1, 2, 3.
Today, when we sit in plush, air-conditioned recording studios like this, equipped with the state-of-the-art sound recording technology and whatnot, taking so many things for granted, we have to pay our homage and tributes to those great artists and those great sound technicians who made all this possible, who made the silent screen to talk, and sometimes even whisper into our ears, saying, wait a minute, you haven't heard nothing yet. So till we meet again, goodbye.